It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here this afternoon. Kishore Mahbubani is Dean and Professor in the Practice of Public Policy of the LKY School of Public Policy. He's previously served for 33 years in Singapore's diplomatic service and is a recognised expert on Asian and world affairs, or at least that's what I read on mahbubani.net, his website, where you can
I toned it down.
where you can buy this and many other books. Indeed, I think the books are available outside. So the format we've decided on today is really in the manner of a conversation. And this builds on many years of friendship. I got to know Kishore when he was very ably representing Singapore in the United Nations, including 2 years on the UN Security Council. Indeed, one of the attractions for me moving to Singapore to the law school was knowing that I'd be a neighbour of Kishore and we'd have opportunities like this to interact. So we'll keep things relatively informal. We'll have a bit of a discussion and then you'll see there are microphones out. We really do hope that our discussion will be a provocation to conversation with all of you. And as I tend to remind my students in the law school, and I see a few here, there will be a class participation component to today's assessment. You will be expected to be active participants. But maybe first of all start off by saying that Kishore, you've really established a niche market for yourself as one of the most thoughtful critics of the West, and indeed there is much to be critical of. I agree in particular with a few of your recurrent criticisms that the institutions of global governance really don't make sense today. It is ridiculous that the IMF is regarded as a European plaything and that the president of the World Bank always has to be American. It's unsustainable that the UN Security Council has 3 permanent members from Europe, 4 if you count Russia, which is arguable, and such little representation of Asia. That ignorance of the rest of the world in much of the West is astonishing. And just to pick an example from 2 weeks ago, during the horrific aftermath of the Boston bombings, the Czech ambassador to the United States had to give a public statement explaining that the Czech Republic is different from Chechnya because the embassy had been receiving threats. So there's a lot to be critical of.
Oh dear.
There's also a lot to be frightened of, however, in the world today. And that as we look around the world, quite apart from the dysfunction of these institutions of global governance and their inability to handle crises, whether it's relatively short-term crises like the global financial crisis or long-term problems like climate change, or the specific crises that crop up from time to time like we're seeing in Syria now, Iran, the South China Sea, North Korea. I suppose my first question is, given all this dysfunction, given all this trouble, why are you smiling? Why are you so optimistic in this book?
I never knew I had to apologize for being happy. Anyway, first of all, I do want to begin by thanking very much my friend and colleague Simon Chesterman for agreeing to do this dialogue with me. And this is actually, I can tell you, a historic occasion in some ways because the law faculty, as you all may know, occupies the upper quadrangle in this Bukit Timah campus. We occupy the lower quadrangle, and quite naturally we always look up to the law faculty every day and admire what it does. But we actually never had a function that involved a conversation between the 2 deans. So this is, I guess, a historic event, and I hope this will lead to more collaboration also and deeper collaboration between our 2 schools. I completely agree with all the points that Simon made in the introduction, and he's absolutely dead right in asking that first question because I just, as I was telling Simon, I've done a 5-week book tour that took me to 14 cities in the United States and UK, and everywhere I went in the West, there's a lot of doom and gloom, you know. There's a feeling that the world is coming to an end. So I had to struggle very hard to tell them that from the point of view of the 7 billion people who live on planet Earth, the last 30 years have been the best 30 years they've enjoyed in the last 300 years. And I emphasize 3 dimensions in which the world is getting a better and better place. First, I mean, the number one worry of societies and civilizations is always about war and peace. Most lives have been lost in wars. And today, the prospect of interstate wars is the lowest that it has ever been. And if you look at all the statistics, the number of people dying in interstate wars is the lowest it's ever been too. And I remember in some of the reviews, one of the reviews, I don't know, The Economist or somewhere said, doesn't Kishore Mahbubani read the newspapers? There's a war in North Korea, a war in Syria, a war in Afghanistan, a war in Congo. And my answer quite simply is that if you add up all the populations of all the countries experiencing interstate war of that kind, it's a drop in the ocean of 7 billion. So for the vast majority of the 7 billion people, the danger of war is receding, and that's a huge leap forward from where we were. Secondly, we've been trying to eradicate global poverty for decades. And I remember in the 1980s and 1990s, people were saying, we will not succeed, we have to give up hope, we'll never win this battle. And guess what? You know, the UN set up some Millennium Development Goals. We're supposed to halve global poverty by 2015. Now, many of the UN Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, will not be met. But the MDG of halving global poverty will be met, and it will be exceeded. We're exceeding the target. And even the United States National Intelligence Council, a relatively conservative body, has come up with an estimate that global poverty, absolute global poverty, will be eliminated by 2030. Now that's a dramatic improvement in the human condition. And to just give you one last example, if you look at it in terms of the explosion of middle classes around the world, in the past, people enjoying middle class living standards were a minority in the world. But now it's exploding. If you just look at Asia alone, from West Asia to East Asia today, the number of people enjoying middle-class living standards is about 500 million people. But by 2020, which is only 7 years from now, the number is going to explode from 500 million to 1.75 billion, an increase of 1.25 billion in 7 years. Now that's the most dramatic improvement in living standards the world has ever seen in human history. So that's why there's so much to be happy about. I can't figure out why people can't be happy.
Okay, well, we might get onto some specific things that are problematic, like climate change, a little bit later. But this optimism is not that new. So at various points in human history, people have said, okay, now Immanuel Kant, this is the plan for perpetual peace. Woodrow Wilson, the League of Nations, and these plans usually don't work. What's interesting about your book and your argument is that you argue this isn't just a happy coincidence, this is because there is the so-called Great Convergence. And I'd like to sort of tease out what that means. The title, I don't think it's actually explained in the book, I assume it's a play on Samuel Huntington's Great Divergence. And this is the idea that at some point, maybe in the 16th, 17th centuries, there was divergence which led to Western civilizational models being triumphant. There are many different explanations for this. Probably the easiest to explain in a setting like this is Jared Diamond's guns, germs and steel philosophy or theory, that it was the combination of Western armament and through force of arms, the colonial powers, germs, that was the spread of disease in some areas that led to Western civilization being the dominant power, and steel in terms of technological prowess. And so that was a divergence. You're suggesting now there is a convergence that would mean that this is not just a happy coincidence, but that it's sustainable, that it's going to be lasting. The metaphor that you use a few times is this idea of a boat. And what I found most interesting about this is not so much the essence of it, that we're all in this together, that it's not simply a matter of 193 separate boats floating around minding their own business, we're all on one ship and there's no captain. What I find interesting is the idea that there can and should be one captain or one system, and that we should all go in one direction. And that's what I'd like to tease out, whether this the essence of this great convergence is, because to me it's far from clear, for example, that the Chinese government, that governments in the Middle East would agree with your assessment that, well, 100 years from now, everyone's going to be democracies, everyone will treat women broadly the same, that we'll all be sailing in one direction. Because political science, for as long as there's been political theory, has been split between those who believe, well, we're all basically the same animals and we're all going to work together, and those who think that we're inherently prone to conflict. So what is it that's driving this convergence? When you articulate it, you present this consensual cluster of norms around science, logic, free market economies, the social contract, multilateralism. This sounds a lot like Western values. And so my next question to you is, I'm not sure if it's one you've been asked before, but by saying that these values will lead to a convergence around a single culture, aren't you a Western imperialist, foisting Western values on the rest of the world?
I'm really, now I'm beginning to be even happier now, you know. This is the first time in my life I've been accused of being a Western imperialist. Because if you go back and look at my website, Mahbubani.net, and look at the reviews of my book, more than half of them say Kishore Mahbubani is anti-Western. So I've come a long way from being anti-Western to becoming a Western imperialist. But Simon is, by the way, dead right, and that clearly my argument is that the world is agreeing to some of what I call some core Western values, which have worked very well for the West and also now working for the rest of the world. But I also want to begin by making a short comment on your introductory comment about what's new. It's been Immanuel Kant talking about perpetual peace and Woodrow Wilson and so on and so forth. You could have also mentioned Norman Angel's book, The Great Illusion. Norman Angel was someone who wrote in the early 20th century who said that the world is becoming so interdependent that there will be no more wars. And then World War I broke out. And so anybody who puts an argument like Norman Angel's is discredited by saying, remember what Norman Angel did exactly 100 years ago. So I actually argue that the 21st century is completely different from the 20th century. And one fundamental reason why it is different from the 20th century is precisely because all over the world there's a convergence, and I apologize for this very boring phrase, consensual cluster of norms. I tried to find a sexy phrase. I couldn't find a sexy phrase, so I chose a boring phrase. But that consensual cluster of norms, the 5 that you mentioned, is the reason why the world is getting to be better and better. Why are more and more economies prospering around the world? Because countries all over the world, with the exception of North Korea maybe, are accepting free market economics and saying that's the way to prosper. Why are people's lives improving? Because Western science and technology is spreading around the world. Simple things like modern medicine is spreading rapidly around the world. And that's why, by the way, when I was going on my book tour, I was watching Farid Zakaria on GPS interviewing Bill Gates. And Bill Gates was asked, how do you feel about the world? Bill Gates says, yeah, well, I'm feeling more and more optimistic. So I was happy to meet another optimist in America. So Farid said, why are you optimistic? He says, well, in my mission of trying to save babies' lives, in 1990, 20 million were dying a year. In the year 2000, 12 million were dying a year. Now it's down to 5 million, and soon the number will disappear. So the babies' lives are being saved by an ecosystem surrounding them and by better science and technology all over the world. So people forget that all kinds of positive developments are happening in the world as more and more of us learn from each other on how to build better societies. And one key point I emphasize is this point about the change in social contract. In the past, especially in Asia and Africa and all that, when you had rulers assumed that they had a right to rule. They had a right to, in a sense, command and dominate their people. That was the relationship. But one reason why the Arab Spring happened, why rulers that had been ruling the Arab world for 150 years, or combined, Mubarak, Ben Ali, Gaddafi, the president of Yemen, they all disappeared. because the people said we no longer want these kinds of old dictators running our societies. So people today have a very different relationship with their governments. So these are new ideas that are spreading around the world, and therefore as a result of it creating better and better societies. And I also think, frankly, the rest of the world should send the West a thank you note and say thank you. It's your ideas that have helped us, and we should thank you for this.
Okay, if the journalist here would like to note that Kishore Mahbubani has not denied that he is a Western imperialist, that'll be a useful headline tomorrow. On the Arab Spring, I mean, we might
I'd be delighted to be called a Western imperialist.
We might quibble about how successful the Arab Spring's been, but maybe on this question of Western values, and candidly, this is an issue that I've raised with you before. In Kishore's last book, The New Asian Hemisphere, there's a wonderful...
I'm glad there's one person here who's read all my books.
Well, there's a very nice foreword where he says that he was advised by many people not to publish this book or not to publish it in the form that he did. I'm glad that you did publish it, but I was one of the people who had picked you up on something, and I'm going to pick you up on it again, that often when you say the West, it's not clear whether you mean the Enlightenment tradition, which you seem to be in favor of, Western civilization as a whole, which famously Mahatma Gandhi was once asked, what do you think of Western civilization? He said, I think it would be a very good idea for the West to become civilized. But when you mean specifically the United States, and sometimes when you mean just the Bush administration or just Charles Krauthammer, and I think it's very important that you distinguish between them, because sometimes in the book, again, candidly, you don't always. So there's a couple of passages where you talk about how Western leaders will not advocate multilateralism because they'll be derided at home. And that's true in the United States. It's not true anywhere else in the West. The whole European project is multilateralism. So maybe a more nuanced critique, if you like, of whether you're a Western imperialist is maybe you're a European imperialist, trying to embrace those values while insulating yourself from the excesses of the United States. Do you think it's a fair criticism that you sometimes conflate the US and the West?
Yeah, I think that's fair, but you're right. I mean, within the West, of course, the West is a very diverse group, and you do have, on the one hand, United States, again, depending on whether you're Republican or Democrat, as you know, Republicans are far less multilateralist than the Democrats, for example. And even among the Europeans, there's a whole range of views. But when it comes to international diplomacy, and I would focus on that slice, okay? Because it's one thing about how you manage your societies and so on and so forth, because clearly the Europeans believe in more of a welfare state and Americans don't, and so on and so forth. But when it comes to international diplomacy, and I saw this especially in the United Nations, and especially in the United Nations Security Council, where I served for 2 years, when it comes to international diplomacy, the West acts as a relatively cohesive tribe most of the time. Sometimes they disagree, as in the build-up to the Iraq War. There was a major disagreement between Germany and France on the one hand, and United States and UK on the other hand. But if you look, for example, the concrete example I give in my book is about the attitude towards the United Nations and about funding for the United Nations. And I argue very strongly in this book that, let's move to change metaphors from the boat to village. Kofi Annan always argues that the world is now becoming a global village. Now, if the world is becoming a global village, the logical conclusion is that you need to have a village council, and you need to have a stronger village council. And the only global village council that we have that is effective is the United Nations family of institutions, including WHO, IAEA, and others. So at this point in history, it is in the common interest of 7 billion people to strengthen global village councils. But there is one body that in a fairly unified manner is acting to weaken them. And if you look at the voting at the United Nations, when it comes to funding for the United Nations, the Americans and the Europe are exactly on the same side in terms of the zero budget policy and in trying to strangle the United Nations. And I tell my European friends that you're making a big mistake in supporting the Americans in this policy, because this goes against your interests. But as I argue in the book, this also goes against American interests. So when the West acts in a coordinated fashion in keeping multilateral institutions weak, that's the cohesive West that I'm speaking about.
So let's talk about multilateral institutions then, because again, I accept your critique of the structural imbalances, but as I was saying to you before we started, I think there's an argument that while your critique of the West is fair, you're extremely soft on Asia in particular. And what you're suggesting about these new village councils suggests that there are partners, willing partners ready. And I think there's a need for evidence of that. And just to pick Asia, for example, you mentioned that the West sometimes operates as a bloc. I think that's maybe overstating it a little bit. The United States still does what it wants and the rest will follow on behind. But Asia is non-existent as a bloc. Within the Asia group in the UN, at least my understanding, is the only thing that is discussed in the Asia group. No policies, no shared positions, it's candidacies only. Asia as a continent has the lowest take-up as a proportion of the countries, lowest proportion for any regional grouping, lowest proportion signing on to the International Court of Justice's optional declaration, compulsory jurisdiction, I'm sorry. Not just human rights treaties like the ICCPR, but the International Covenant on Civil and on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. It's got the smallest proportion of countries that are members of the WTO and the International Criminal Court. So if these institutions are meant to play the role of the village council, why is it that Asia has been so, or Asian countries have been so reluctant to embrace the institutions they have, or indeed to form their own? In Africa, there's the African Union. In the Americas, there's the Organization of American States. The EU exists separately. Asia has no regional organization. And for many Asian countries, they seem extremely wary of any kind of multilateralism. And we're seeing that very prominently now in the attitude of China, for example, towards the South China Sea, with a great resistance to any kind of multilateralism. ASEAN is maybe an interesting exception to that, but across the continent, there's a great allergic reaction is probably too strong. There's a great hesitation about embracing multilateralism. Why are you so optimistic about that?
Well, you're right. I mean, it's the time has come for the Asian countries to do more. And I think if you're going to have the Asian century, and I do believe that we will have the Asian century, then it's pretty clear that the Asian countries will have to step up and provide more leadership. But at the same time, because you see, Asia is, provides almost 60% of the world's population, and so Asia is a very large and diverse place, and there are different dynamics, regional dynamics. You're right. As you know, in my book, I describe ASEAN as a modern miracle, and after the European Union, it's the second most successful example of regional cooperation, second most successful example of multilateralism. But the really big question is what the giants will do, what China and India will do as they emerge as great powers. And the good news that I can share with you all is that in both capitals, there's a lot of thinking going on about what their role should be. In fact, in December, the UNDP invited me to be, December last year, 2012, UNDP invited me to go be the lead international consultant for a project on China and global governance. And I attended a one-day conference in Beijing where you had about 50 Chinese think tanks speaking. And it was an amazing event because you could see when all the think tanks were speaking out, you got this full range of voices coming out of China. You had on one side those who said, hey, the world has been humiliating China for 100 years. They did that because we were weak. Now we are strong. Time for China to stand up. Time for China to be, outspoken and strong and independent. And on the other hand, there was another range of voices saying, China is now the world's biggest beneficiary of this rules-based order. China is the world's biggest exporter. China has got a greater stake in a rules-based world than any other country. China should be taking the lead now to strengthen a rules-based order. So there is a lot of intellectual ferment out there in the various Asian capitals. And that's also part of the reason why I wrote this book at this stage, because if we are on the same boat, on the same village, the Asians can no longer be free riders. the Asians now have to step up and do more in terms of taking on global responsibilities.
So maybe let me give you two examples of where China is stepping up, which I'd be interested in your reaction to. So both in the UN and independently, as it were. Within the UN, one of the things you highlight, and we can talk about that later, is possible restructuring of the Security Council. Since 2007, there have been 12 vetoes cast in the Security Council, 1 by the United States, 6 by Russia, 5 by China. So China is engaging, and you can argue whether its vetoes on Syria are appropriate or not, but it's certainly engaging, and it would be misleading to suggest that it's the United States as the only dysfunctional power here. The second thing China's been doing is continuing to expand its defense expenditure by 10% every year.
Defense?
Defense.
Yeah.
So in 2012, Asian defense expenditure overtook NATO European defense expenditure. And depending on the projections, the International Institute for Strategic Studies projects that China will match US defense expenditure as early as 2022 or as late as 2042. So how does this fit with your idea of China in particular and Asia in general merely embracing the existing order as opposed to, understandably, wanting to play a role in shaping that order? Not in a revolutionary way, but in assuming its rightful place at the seat of world power.
Yeah. Well, I think when you deal with the UN Security Council and the P5, what you always see in public are the differences. But as I explain in the book at great length, that what goes on behind the scenes is a lot of collaboration. And there are all kinds of trade-offs among the P5. And I can tell you one reason why the US-China relationship, which now should have rising levels of tension, doesn't have rising levels of tension, but actually has a surprising degree of collaboration, is because in the P5, on a daily basis, China and US collaborate and cooperate and make trade-offs. So you see only the tip of the iceberg, which are the few vetoes of disagreement. But beneath the iceberg, there's 95% of agreement on the agenda of the UN Security Council. And in fact, the trade-offs, and I quote the German ambassador, if I'm not mistaken, in this book, saying there's a kind of a cozy club among the P5 and on collaboration, and that's a big story in itself, which, by the way, is good for the world and not necessarily bad for the world, because they do collaborate to try and find solutions to problems. And on the defense budget, it is true that China has the fastest growing defense budget in the world, but that's because China also has the fastest growing economy in the world. And if I'm not mistaken, as a percentage of its economy, China's defense budget is more or less constant and hasn't increased significantly. But more importantly, as I argue in the book, this is the time, before China becomes a really major military power, it's time for the United States and China to achieve an understanding on what should be the correct expenditure for military expenses. And I say it's an absolute mistake for the United States to carry on its aggressive naval patrolling 12 miles off China's shores, which is still continuing to do, because if America keeps on patrolling aggressively off China's shores, 12 miles of its shores today, within 10 to 20 years, there'll be Chinese ships aggressively patrolling 12 miles off California's shores. And if it is not in American interest to have Chinese ships off your shores 12 miles away 20 years from now, reach an understanding now. So I argue very strongly in the book that the United States and China should have a dialogue on what should be the right level of military expenses. Because when it comes to military expenses, the United States still spends almost as much as the rest of the world combined. And by doing so, it is actually providing the excuse for China to do so. Because China is saying, if America can spend more than the rest of the world combined, why can't I do so? Why should China restrain itself when the United States is not restraining itself? So the United States, it is now in the US interest to actually work with China, prevent the sharp increase in defense expenditures.
I think this reminds me of a discussion we had about 9, maybe even 10 years ago in New York, which you touch on in the book. This is a bit of a footnote to our discussion, but on US-Chinese relations, that Many of you will recall when the Bush administration came to power, there was an initial, well, they didn't call it a pivot, but it was a shift from seeing China as a strategic partner. The language became strategic competitor. There was the EP-3 spy plane incident, the plane that had to crash land in Hainan. And then September 11 happened, and China was off the radar completely, which appeared to be basically what China would have wanted in an ideal world. And so it was a few years later, when we were both living in New York, that we had a discussion about the winners and losers from September 11. And I think the general consensus was that China had won, because China was off the US foreign policy radar for many years, and by the time it came back on, and the pivot to Asia now, China's economy and its political sophistication, its engagement with institutions of world order has developed to the point that it's no longer a meaningful question of containing China, but engaging with China.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because once I wrote a column recently, I think it was on the around the 10th anniversary of 9/11, on 2011, I wrote a column, and in that column I just quoted Hong Kong correspondent Frank Ching, and Frank Ching said, not he said it, I didn't say it, that Osama bin Laden was a huge geopolitical gift to China, because thanks to Osama bin Laden, America got sidetracked into the Middle East and China got a free ride. And I can tell you that that column was noticed in China, because one year when I was welcoming we run a master's in public administration in management in Chinese. And when I welcomed the class to our school, and actually I was talking to them in the law faculty room up there, and after I said my nice warm words of welcome, I said, do you have any questions? One of the students stood up and said in Chinese, and I couldn't, there was translation for me, he said, why do you say Osama bin Laden was a geopolitical gift for China? So people read it, these things. But it's a fact. It's an absolute fact that both the 9/11 and the American invasion of Iraq were huge geopolitical gifts to China. And it's a big mistake for the United States to give the geopolitical gifts.
So maybe we could talk a little bit about something which is a slight shift in topic, and it's about development assistance. Because in the book, there is a chapter that is extremely critical of Western development policy. This is something I've written on a little bit in the context of post-conflict administration, where most of aid, I would agree with you, tends to be supply-driven rather than demand-driven. And so it's the interests of donors, broadly understood. There are elements of altruism, I think, and those should be encouraged. But you are extremely critical of the OECD in particular, arguing that basically the OECD's aid program should be shut down completely. This is $136 billion a year, should be shut down, and all the money should go where? To funding public policy schools.
You all agree, right?
I think we've got a bit of a captive audience here. But do you seriously argue that all aid is wasted?
Yeah. Well, by the way, this is chapter 6. Huh? I strongly recommend chapter 6 to you. No, because, I wouldn't say that all aid should be cut off. In fact, I do give, in the book, I do say, I was in Bhutan, for example, and when you go to Bhutan, you have this wonderful bridge that the Japanese built across a very deep gorge, And as I looked down the gorge, I said, my God, in the old days, they have to go all the way down to the bottom of the gorge, cross the stream, walk all the way up to the gorge to cross that very deep gorge. The Japanese built a bridge, and it was a wonderful gift by Japan to Bhutan. So there are examples like that work. Clearly, there are many examples that work. But my main criticism of the OECD is that, it's called the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. So it should provide the most honest, objective analysis of what happens to Western aid when it goes overseas. And I make the claim in the book that for every dollar that is supposed to go from a Western country to a poor developing country, out of that dollar, 20 cents will go for administration expenses. So that goes back to the donor. 20 cents or 30 cents will go to a consultant. That will go back to the donor. 20 or 30 cents may go to some equipment. The equipment will reach the country, if you're lucky. The money goes back to the donor country to buy the equipment for the donor country. So at the end of the day, the net gain that a recipient country may get from $1 is roughly 10 to 20%, 10 to 20 cents a dollar. And by the way, you know, I was telling Simon before coming here, if you look at one of the recent issues of Newsweek, now it's no longer in print edition, now you have to read it on iPad or something. There's an 80-year-old American woman still living in Kabul and working to help the Afghans. And she was asked, what do you think of American aid to Afghanistan? And she says 90% of it goes to contractors and crooks, and the Afghans don't get the money at all. You know, and I tell the story. I begin the chapter by quoting from a story written by Claire Lockhart and Ashraf Ghani in their book. And you know, that in theory, there's $200 million was sent to try and build a school schools in Afghanistan. And out of the $200 million, money went to one contractor, another contractor, third contractor, fourth contractor. At the end of the day, a pile of wood arrived in Afghanistan to build a school. And it just sat there because there's no other money to do anything else. And then when one winter came along, they felt very cold. The Afghans burned that wood, and Ashraf Ghani and Claire Lockhart said, we saw $200 million go up in smoke. I mean, these are the kind of horror stories about Western aid which are never exposed by the OECD. And so when I was at the UN, the Western governments always kept saying that all international organizations should have a sunset clause. So if you have a UN program for something, do it for 5 years, and then there should be a sunset provision. So let's apply the Western principle of sunset provisions to the OECD, because the OECD is not helping the world in terms of improving the delivery of foreign aid. And if you don't believe me, read my chapter.
Which first you have to make a donation to Kishore Mahbubani outside to buy the book. But there's anyone who attends conferences or an aspiring academic, whenever someone makes a specific comment, you criticize them at the general level. If they make a general level, you criticize them at the specific. I'm just letting you into the secrets of academic discourse. So you make these sort of specific comments, but wouldn't you accept that development has radically transformed the world? I mean, you began by saying you're optimistic because so many people have been lifted out of poverty into the middle class. And let's pick an example, I don't know, say Singapore, where the vast majority of the credit goes to the local population, enlightened leadership, and so on. But there were a couple of UNDP technical experts, Albert Winsemius and I.F. Tung, who came here and were subsequently recognized as having had a major impact on Singapore's development. So is there a danger that by suggesting, and you literally do say that the OECD should shutter the organization, is there a baby and bathwater problem here?
Well, I mean, as you know, the OECD doesn't deliver the foreign aid. The OECD monitors the foreign aid. So it is failing in its monitoring mechanism. And I would be very happy to see an independent monitoring mechanism established to see what happens to all this money. Because in theory, you're right, $136 billion is supposed to go from the developed countries to the developing countries. I want somebody independent to do an audit. So where it is doing good, like I mentioned in Bhutan or like in Singapore, the UNDP technical experts, then fine, let the good aspects carry on. But unfortunately, there are story after story of money that is corruptly taken away by contractors and crooks, as the lady said. And I can tell you, my first experience with foreign aid began in 1973. I mean, long before many of you were born, I think. When I was serving in Cambodia, in Phnom Penh. This was a city at war. Every day it was being shelled by the Khmer Rouge. And this was a government that was essentially run by the Americans in many ways. And I met a very young American diplomat. And and I asked her, what do you do in Phnom Penh? She says, well, every morning I wake up, I get instructions from Washington, D.C. on what needs to be done. I go and call on the Minister for Economy, who was a friend of mine, and I said, this is what you should do today. So, there was total removal of any kind of responsibility from the government. The government was told, you have to do A, you have to do B, you have to do C. Now, this kind of technical foreign aid destroys a country because you don't give the chance for the country to develop and make its own decisions. You're telling them what to do, what is best for you. And there, in the area of foreign aid, there's so many horror stories out there. And it's remarkable that more people do not know about it, which is why I wrote a whole chapter about it. And if you go to country after country, I mean, the other classic story that I'm told always is in the case of Zaire, which is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, used to be run by Belgium. The Belgians built a beautiful, straight 1,000-mile road. It began in a port, it ended nowhere. But it didn't matter, because the Belgian contractor got all the money, and he was happy, and nothing changed in Congo. So it is the fact that there's so many horror stories like this that are not exposed is the reason why I think we should have a more open and candid discussion on foreign aid. And if it leads to better delivery, I'll be very happy.
Yeah, I mean, this criticism of aid, I mean, because you mentioned the social contract before, one trenchant critic of policies in Afghanistan in particular, I think Bani Rubin, has a very helpful idea of the reverse social contract, which reflects what you're saying, which is that in a traditional model of a social contract, the population agreed to transfer certain coercive political powers to a central political entity in exchange for security. Where there's a kind of democratic or some kind of representative political system, then this social contract can be reinforced. The problem in the situations you're highlighting is that there's a reverse social contract because the government isn't responsive to the policy needs of the people that it's meant to be serving, but to exterior entities, which might actually call upon the government to do things that are domestically unpopular, which actually undermines the local social contract and can be a real barrier, not just to economic development, but to political development. So I think there's some common ground there, but I think to pick a couple of countries, Tanzania, Mozambique, Kenya, Botswana, I think there'd be a few countries which would disagree on the net benefits of aid. And indeed, you highlight them in the book when you're talking about the up-and-coming countries. Many of them have profited from aid. But maybe let's switch to a long-term problem that I mentioned at the beginning, which is climate change. Because this is something that I actually felt a bit frustrated reading the book, wishing you would say more about how this convergence is going to help. Because your repeated criticisms, again, entirely justified of the West, are that Western powers operate in accordance with national interest. But so does everyone. And that's the collective action problem that is climate change. That's why Copenhagen broke down. That's why it's so hard to get any meaningful agreement on climate change, because there will have to be sacrifices all round. So I think in the book you point out that, and I agree with you again, that if the US imposed $1, why not a $2 tax on gasoline? It would increase the cost of energy in the United States, would have a positive impact on the environment, a negative impact on the US economy, arguably. I think you're rightly critical of the US for not embracing this, at least idea, seriously. You're rightly critical of the US for its attitude towards the Copenhagen negotiations. But the most you do about China and India is say that they've been free riders. Nowhere in the book, at least nowhere that I could see, did you suggest that China, India, the rest of the world need to do some heavy lifting also? Don't you think they need to in order to reach some kind of deal on climate change? I certainly agree that China and India need to do more. But I'm surprised you don't quote the most provocative statement I make on climate change. I say it's time for Al Gore to return his Nobel Peace Prize, because after he got his Nobel Peace Prize, he's had no impact at all on American policy on climate change. I would have, but I know how much you enjoy quoting yourself, Kishore.
Anyway, so since there's been, as you know, no change in in American policies on that. And the reason why I emphasize the role of the West and America is that the climate change is a result not just of the new flows of greenhouse gas emissions is also a result of the stock of greenhouse gas emissions that has been put up by the West since the Industrial Revolution. And the only way you can solve this climate change problem is by putting an economic price on greenhouse gas emissions, whatever carbon tax or increased gasoline taxes and so on and so forth. So to do that, if you want to persuade China and India to pay an economic price, which I think they should, for new flows of greenhouse gas emissions, you've got to find an equitable formula that also imposes the same economic price on the West for its new flows and for its stock of greenhouse gas emissions that is put up. That's the China-India argument. They say, okay,
which they would argue, which the West would argue, the whole world profits from, because as you highlight, it's technology that has enabled much of the world to rise up out of poverty. It's this technological innovation that's built on the back of the Industrial Revolution, which is part of the major cause of the legacy climate change.
But you know, the problem with the United States is that it doesn't even want to pay, forget the stock, it doesn't even want to pay for the current flows of greenhouse gas emissions. And the fact that the United States is not willing to put a cent on the table in terms of sacrifices for climate change completely undermines its moral authority when it comes to discussing climate change. And this is why I do wish that the United States would come up and be more positive on climate change. But the really good news I have for all of you is that it is true that when the climate change negotiations started, and especially in the Kyoto Protocol and all that, the position of China and India was that it is a problem of the West. You take care of it, we didn't contribute to it, we will do nothing about it. And that was the China-India position. Now in the last 2-3 years, there has been a significant shift in the negotiating position of China and India now. China and India now say, okay, we accept that this is a problem, we are prepared to make a contribution now. But the question they ask is, if we make the contribution, what will your contribution be? And as you know, the problem is that the United States contributes zero. Now, the other piece of really good news I have for you is that just this past weekend, on Friday and Saturday, we organized a conference right here across the hall in our school, where we got a group of Chinese scholars and Indian scholars to talk about China's and India's roles in the world to come. And at that conference, one of the most impressive presentations was made by a Chinese scholar, Dr. Pan, his name is Jia Hua, I think. And this Chinese scholar has made presentations to the Chinese Politburo, and in his argument to the Chinese Politburo is that it doesn't matter what the West does anymore. We, China, we will suffer also if there's climate change and global warming. So for our own sake, we should do more. And he says he's put forward a plan to the Chinese government that let us not just go for modernization and economic development, let us try to build what he calls an ecological civilization. Now the fact that you have Chinese scholars now being ahead of the curve of American scholars in this area is quite a remarkable development in the world. And the tragedy is that the Western media will never report this. The Western media will report all the negative things that China does and will never report any of the positive things that China does. For example, people who read my book, some Westerners said to me, Kishore, I did not know until I read your book that China has already done a reforestation program the size of Belgium, and by the time China finishes, its reforestation program will cover an area the size of France. The Western media will never report this. So this is the problem we face in the world, that you always get the sense the Western point of view coming at you and never understand what the rest of the world thinks. And that's why I try to give the alternate point of view.
Okay, maybe one last topic, and then we'll invite questions and comments from the floor, which is something I know dear to your heart, which is the UN. So you've served as Singapore's ambassador to the UN, you've sat on the Security Council, I know there are some ambassadors here tonight. If you were the ambassador of France or Britain, in what universe would you endorse this crazy Mahbubani plan for reforming the Security Council and giving up a permanent seat on the Council in exchange to the and passing it on to the European Union?
Yeah. Well, I think the choice that the British and the French and the P5 have is a very simple one. The UN was created in 1945 with 5 permanent members. And they were chosen because they won World War II in 1945. Now, if 100 years from now, in 2045, which is only 32 years from now, if the Security Council still has the same 5 permanent members, I guarantee you that there will be a Security Council, but there will be a Security Council with no legitimacy. So there's no point for the permanent members to retain their seats and lose their legitimacy. So to preserve their legitimacy, you have to include not yesterday's great powers in the UN Security Council, but today's or tomorrow's great powers in the Security Council. And as you know, in the book, what I try to do is provide a win-win-win formula whereby you have the great powers of today's from all regions, the 7, which are United States, China, Russia, keep their places. UK and France have to cede it to the European Union, which they're a member of, because there's a common European security.
For the moment, the UK might not be by the second issue of your book.
Yeah, well, let's see whether they leave. And then, of course, the most populous and largest economies in the regions, India, Brazil, Nigeria, will become permanent members. But the new thing that I suggest in the book is that when I serve as the ambassador to the UN, the reason why UN Security Council reform did not take place was because for every Brazil that wants to come in, Argentina will try to say, why not me? For every India that comes in, Pakistan says, why not me? But I can tell you the most ingenious argument was put forward by the Italian ambassador, I think, who said, why are you just pushing for Germany and Japan to become permanent members? We, Italy, we lost World War II also. So you can see how jealous countries are. That's why I proposed the creation of a new category of semi-permanent members. So all the near losers also become winners in the formula.
So why don't you, yours is innovative, partly in that you don't propose Japan as a permanent member, when it's now contributing the second largest financial contribution to the UN and a growing peacekeeping presence. You don't put Japan up there?
Well, I'll tell you what several African ambassadors have said to me. As you know, Japan even lost an election once to Bangladesh for the election to the UN Security Council. And when I asked the African ambassadors, why did Japan lose? They say, what's the point of voting for Japan in the UN Security Council? I'm only giving America 2 votes. Because the Japanese vote exactly like the Americans do in the UN. This is again something that is sort of publicly expressed in the UN. So Japan has got to demonstrate that it can be an independent foreign policy player to enhance, burnish its credentials, and then you'll have a stronger claim.
So the problem with this, quite apart from the chess game of who gets on the council, and this is one of the reasons why I've actually opposed various forms of Security Council expansion, is that I accept it might make the council more legitimate. Would it make it more effective? Would giving India, Brazil, Nigeria vetoes over any council activity be more effective than what we have now in resolving at least matters of peace and security?
Yes, it will make it more effective because it will make it more credible. Because I think that the danger the Security Council faces today is people look at the Security Council and say, why should the West, which represents 12% of the world's population, have 60% of the permanent members of the UN Security Council?
Who is saying this? Who is disregarding the Security Council?
Well, I think the changes will come gradually. I mean, when legitimacy, when you begin to lose legitimacy, it can happen, you will see a gradual process of erosion. But there are several, if you look at the speeches made by several leaders, I quote the Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan and what he says about the UN Security Council. You've got to be very careful with this. There's a rising tide of criticisms. Then if I were the Security Council, I'd be worried about it.
Well, I think there is some evidence of self-restraint on the part of the Council in terms of the way it's approached targeted financial sanctions. In terms of the members, it is interesting that I think Britain and France, which are the dubious members of the Council in your arithmetic, have not cast a veto in the 21st century.
I'm a bit more polite to them.
Well, but it's interesting they have not cast vetoes in the 21st century, which might be because they want everyone to get along, but also I think because they realise that they
will lose their seats.
Well, that their claim to the seat would be called into question. Okay, well, we've got about 15 minutes more, and I would like to give people an opportunity to pose questions or comments on anything we've said, or indeed anything else. And I see a good doctoral student from the law school coming down to ask questions, doubtless agreeing with everything I've said.
Not at all.
I hope not.
I hope I made...
Are you allowed to disagree with your dean?
Indeed.
Yes. I have two comments come questions. First is on the broader point of convergence. Are you not in a way again rebundling what Niall Ferguson has been arguing, civilization west and the rest, and imposing the same so-called good ideas to the east which you think have worked well in the west? So it's rather less of a convergence and more of an imposition. The convergence would be where you have ideas of the east coming in on the international fora, and then you say that yes, there is convergence of both ideas. So isn't there more of an imposition and less of a convergence? And how does this stand in view of the failure of the so-called free market economics? Because the whole Western economy itself is moving more towards the Keynesian or the socialist model of the free market economy. So do these concepts really stand in the present situation? That's point number one. Point number two, on the specifics of China, you made a lot of interesting points. Don't they sound utopian at times? Because if you see what is happening in the South China Sea, there are a lot of provocative things which China is doing. Secondly, there are consistent attacks although still in the virtual world, but on strategic United States like the banks and the security agencies. The New York Times is filled every day with one or the other hacking attack on strategic agencies. And thirdly, China has intruded 19 kilometers into India and set up tents. The situation is highly tense. And are you sure that we are not heading towards the next war, and maybe the whole statistics might crumble down in the next few months to come? Thank you.
Okay, so thank you. So even worse than me accusing you of being a Western imperialist, you're now accused of being Neil Ferguson, which is, I think, skirting on the edges of defamation in Singapore. And detailed questions about China.
I got a good lawyer, by the way, here.
And detailed questions about China.
No, anyway, the last point, by the way, just to, if indeed there's a war between China and India, then I'm wrong. Then my thesis is wrong. But if despite this very serious incident which you referred to, and by the way, he's right, there is a lot of tension now at the border between China and India, in case you're not aware of it. If this incident is solved peacefully, right, one way or another, then I'm right. So there's an empirical test that we will in the next few weeks, let's watch. And so either he may be proven right. I mean, certainly, if there's a war breaks out, he's right. If there's no war, then my book is right. Then my thesis is right. That indeed there are forces that are actually pushing countries to avoid wars. And these are the forces that I describe in the book, And I want to make 2 points, 2 important points. First one, on your first part on convergence, I must emphasize that when I speak about convergence, I also say that the success of the rest of the world is going to lead to the transition from a mono-civilizational world to a multi-civilizational world. And in fact, as a result, the economic development in Asia and Africa and elsewhere, you're also going to see subsequently a cultural renaissance happening in these countries, and you will see the flourishing of different civilizations in the world. It will be a much more interesting world. So the convergence is on things like living standards and methods of managing societies and so on and so forth. But the results will not be a boring mono-civilizational world at all. I'm going to emphasize that point. But the second point about China, I talk about 7 global contradictions in the world. And one of the global contradictions is between China and the rest of the world. In fact, I had dinner with a visiting Chinese leader. And I said to him, I told this Chinese leader, I said, China must prepare itself for more tensions with the rest of the world. He said to me, why? I said, it's very simple. I say we live in a global village that is getting smaller and smaller day by day. In the middle of the global village is a house that's getting bigger and bigger by the day. That house is China. So if you're a member of the remaining 5.7 billion people of the world, you feel squeezed by a shrinking global village and an expanding China. So you naturally get resentful towards China. And then sure enough, there are demonstrations against the Chinese in Latin America and Africa. And I say this is the time things to come. So the Chinese themselves are going to face a lot of problems in the world. And I give a lot of space to the South China Sea in the book. And I say the Chinese have made fundamental mistake in printing that 9-dashed line in the South China Sea. Because as I say, the 9-dashed line is an albatross around the Chinese necks. And it is better for the Chinese to find a graceful way of backing out of that. It's going to be difficult. But again, if there's a war in the South China Sea, then I'm wrong. But if there is a solution, and there'll be very carefully phrased pragmatic solutions to these problems. There will not be a big deal, but there'll be careful pragmatic solutions along the way. And if war is avoided, then the thesis is right.
Okay, we're getting some falsifiable data from the Dean of the School of Public Policy. Please, sir, if you could use the microphone, maybe introduce yourself very briefly.
Good evening to you all. I'm Mohit Varshne. There are two questions, and those questions were actually raised to me by one of my friends. And just now the reference of eradication of poverty came. So on that thing, my friend had asked me that if Singapore can eradicate poverty in last 50 or 40 years in such a small span of time with such a supersonic speed, why can't the rest of the world do the same? Why can't the thing can be achieved by the rest of the world? And one more question he asked me, that the financial center may be shifting in few years or decades from New York. So will it, which will be where it will be shifting to, Shanghai, Hong Kong or Singapore? So these were the two questions he asked. So maybe I thought if I get an opportunity to ask from an eminent person, so I'll put forth that question. And thank you for giving me that opportunity.
Well, I mean, on the first question on global poverty, as I emphasized at the beginning, we are winning the struggle against global poverty. And again, I must emphasize that a lot of the data is not mine. This is data by various scholars in the world, in UN data, United States National Intelligence Council data, and so on and so forth. So we are winning the struggle against poverty around the world, and I think we're going to win faster and faster in the years to come. On the question of financial centers, I can tell you I'm not an expert in that area. I think New York will remain for a long time the leading financial center, because it's not just about the size and strength of the country. It's also about the ecosystem that you have built up. You know, the lawyers, the consultants, the networks, and the trust. You know, and you know, if, for example, one of the greatest anomalies of the world today is that the biggest creditors in the world are the Asian countries. They have the largest foreign reserves. But when they give out loans, most of their loans go out through New York. Why? Because the system protects their loans when they go out through New York. They have a greater chance of the loans coming back to being repaid to them. So that's the reason why, in theory, the Asian loan should go through Asian financial centers. But there's greater trust and faith in the New York financial system. So it takes a long time to build and replace a financial system. So I don't see that change happening soon.
Maybe just a footnote on that from the legal dimension. One of the reasons that there are two big financial capitals still, New York and London. And one reason why London remains a financial capital is the legacy of colonialism, and in particular the fact that many regimes, many countries around the world are happy to conclude agreements and have them resolved in accordance with English law. So in terms of your choice of Asian jurisdiction, one of the things that Singapore is positioning itself as, and this also goes to your question about Singapore's development, is as the legal services center of Asia. And indeed, in terms of brand identity, there's no country in the world whose brand identity is more closely tied to law than Singapore. And in terms of positioning Singapore as a global financial center, the rule of law remains extremely important. And it's one thing it's got ahead of Shanghai and arguably Hong Kong, although Hong Kong has specific issues to do with the mix of colonialism and its connection to China now. Please, sir.
Raymond Kwok from Oxford Economics and VC.com. Kishore, I didn't read the book, my apologies, but I think from what I gathered during the discussion, there's a lot of talking about the West's ideas is been beneficial to the world and is sort of coming to the East. But what you are proposing actually is the merger, is the conversion. Can you share with us what the East can contribute in this conversion?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to learn that you haven't read the book. It means you haven't bought the book, and I hope you buy a copy. Are you also selling books after this? No, I think, seriously, I think the next few books that I hope to write will have to be what Asians have to do more. And I think it's very clear that with economic power shifting to Asia, the Asians can no longer just get by criticizing the West. They have to come up with their own ideas on how to reform global institutions and to provide global leadership, and to also explain how they will contribute to a better world, And I mean, that's also one of the reasons why I wrote this book, because I thought it'd be useful to have at least one Asian formula for reforming the UN Security Council, right? To say, okay, this is one suggestion I have. And if you really want to fix the world, you can no longer just criticize, you have to come up with concrete suggestions on how you think you can do it better. And I hope that's one of the small contributions I hope that my books will make. But I think we need more and more contributions from Asian scholars in this area. So my role, I hope, is to be like a catalyst that spurs others to make contributions also.
Please, 1, 2. We might actually take a couple. Dave, do you want to jump up and ask your question?
I'm Dr. Jahangir from NUS. My question is, the world's largest media, like BBC, CNN, CNBC, are they neutral?
Are they what, sorry?
Are they neutral or biased? How they contribute to this great convergence?
Well, okay, you want to get some more questions?
Yeah, David, do you want to ask your question next?
Yeah.
We'll collect a couple so that we have a chance to...
You're going to finish by 6:30.
Yeah.
Thank you. David Taylor, Dean of International Relations at Overseas Family School. I have bought your book, Kindle version, cheaper. Read it twice, even cheaper. Correct me, shoot me down right away if I'm wrong here. This is a question about the need for the strengthening of the global institutions, of rule of law and of governance. And I'm thinking, before the British pulled out of Hong Kong, they made an attempt to strengthen certain institutions, democratic institutions, which, two things, came across as a bit disingenuous that late in the game, and really haven't meant much under the extraordinary influence of China. I'm wondering if, maybe not quite as late in the game, but still, would it come across as being disingenuous for the West to dramatically try to strengthen these international organizations now that they're slipping out of a position of being able to do what they want? And would they survive extraordinary influence from China? Thank you.
There was one more question at the back. I figured there was a hand I saw. If you put your... Okay, we'll take you two. Yes, Akanksha, and the gentleman behind. If you can both come to the microphone and ask your questions, then we'll have to make that the last question, please.
Okay, I have two questions. I might be wrong because I haven't read the book. So I want to understand exactly what you're saying by convergence, because when you give the example of the boat, so is this all countries on one boat going towards one point, or is it all countries? There's a center convergence point, and then all countries are separately coming to that point. That's something that I want to understand. And the second thing is, again, about the Security Council expansion. We had a discussion a lot with Professor Chesterman in class. And I want to understand, you said that when it's expanded in the manner that you are describing, it'll have more credibility and therefore more legitimacy. Are you equating legitimacy to credibility? And if you are, do you mean to say that if it's expanded in a way, since it will be more representative, it will be more credible? So what do you mean by that?
Okay, thank you. And the last question, the gentleman, yeah.
So I want to ask a specific question. Feel free to disregard it because we have quite a few questions to answer. So feel free to disregard it, it's not exactly the point. But it's a very specific question that has to do with convergence, what you said at the beginning, as regards to one of the aspects because of which you were optimistic is because of the fact that more and more millions of people are living middle class life. And I'm sure that data is invaluable. But interestingly, in the European Union, especially now the crisis in South Europe, especially Greece and Cyprus, the two states, both in the EU and in globalization, we do see, at least in the West, at least in the EU, a crisis of the middle class. We see the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. So I wanted to ask, how does this, and the second element that I'm going to mention right now, how is this going to allow us to be optimistic when it regards to convergence and the middle class rising? And the second element is this, natural resources, right? In several occasions you mentioned how important the increase of the population is, right? However, whether the natural resources, and especially water, would be adequate in order to cover all the needs of the people, that I think goes back and forth with the question, right? I was in Bangkok just a few years ago, and the United States Embassy organized an interesting documentary about water. So some examples that were mentioned were, for example, some European companies like Leslie go to the United States, they drill deep, and they take water that was before taken for free by the locals, they put it into bottles, and now they sell it. International Monetary Fund and different agencies for Africa, they build dams, and although there are some poor people in Africa that before they could get water for free, now have to buy it from bottles, same water. So just like before you were saying that money goes to contractors, interestingly I was thinking just like we said with several development programs, water-related development programs in Africa and Asia, the money doesn't really go to water supply of the people. Well, maybe to the ones that can afford to buy it, but mostly to the investors that they were then. So these two things, the middle class crisis, at least in South Europe, probably more countries that I'm not aware of, and water supply problem, which is, I mean, out of the energy more important than water, right? Whether that totally necessary resource for the survival of human species, whether these two factors will allow this rising middle class, or the fact that more and more people of this Asia have the privilege to enjoy middle class living, will that effect be long lasting?
Okay, so you've got 4 questions, you've got 30 seconds.
You're right, you're absolutely right. And as usual, the most interesting questions come at the very end. This is a kind of a logic to them. So I'll give one-line answers to everybody, if you don't mind. On the media, I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that BBC, CNN, CNBC, they will reflect their national points of view. But the good news is that there are all kinds of new media emerging. I mean, to give you an obvious example, if you watch Al Jazeera, it gives you a very different perspective on developments over there. And interestingly, even China is coming out with various CCTV channels. And you want a different perspective, you can log on the internet and see different perspectives. And the David Taylor's question is a very important one, but I do believe that unlike Hong Kong, where in a sense things were done too late, it is not too late for the West to reform the international order in terms of rule of law. In fact, this is the time for the West to begin strengthening rule of law globally, and that's one of the key messages I have on the book. On the boat, let me just explain what I mean by the boat metaphor is that before, when you live in 193 separate countries, you live in 193 separate boats. Today, when you live in 193 separate countries, you live in 193 separate cabins. On the same boat, you have captains and crews taking care of each cabin, no captain and crew taking care of the boat as a whole. So the only purpose of the metaphor is to emphasize we need to strengthen institutions or global governance, but you can never push a metaphor too far, You use it for a specific message.
Otherwise, if you push that metaphor too far, it goes off a cliff, doesn't it?
That's what happened. And then on the whole legitimacy, credibility, which is a very profound and very important question, one, if you have a more representative council, it is more legitimate. But also, I also believe you have a more representative council, you also get a different council in terms of its decision making, and I believe it'll be better also. And that's my view. Most people think that it'll be worse. I believe it'll be better, but that's on the basis of experience rather than anything else. On the middle class and on natural resources, we face a very unusual situation today where for a long time the most optimistic middle classes in the world were always in the West and not in the rest of the world. And today, in the last few years, something remarkable has happened where optimism is disappearing from Western middle classes. Now, but I do believe that there will not be just doom and gloom for the West. I actually think the West will benefit from the great convergence, will benefit from a larger global economy, that there are opportunities out there for the West, but you've got to change your mindset to take advantage of it. And on natural resources, finally, specifically on water, just to tell you that our school has an Institute of Water Policy, you know. And you know, one of the most amazing things I learned after the Institute of Water Policy was set up, you always assume that the best water authorities in the world are in the West, right? But there's one water authority in a poor developing country that is outperforming any of the privatized water authorities in the United Kingdom. And where is that water authority? It's in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. And the fact that a third world country that has suffered so much as Cambodia can produce a water authority that is superior to any British privatized water authority is a sign that the convergence is taking place, and you have best practices now in places that are outside the rest of the world. So on many of these areas, there are good news stories that we should also pay attention to.
As I was reading that story in your book, I was reminded of one of the first conferences that I helped organize, an international one in Botswana, in Gaborone. And at the end of the conference, one of the co-organizers, local co-organizers, asked us if we'd like to take a tour of the city. And I hadn't really seen it, so I said, sure, jumped in his car. And the first place he took us was to a water purification plant. And we got out and we took photos of ourselves in front of this water purification plant. He was so proud. That's not a joke, it's a true story. We're out of time, and I think this is a remarkable evening for me, not least because it's the first time Kishore has ever gone through a talk without giving 3 points. So I'm going to give you 3 pieces of good news to finish. The first is that clearly there are many reasons to be optimistic. There are things to be optimistic, there are also things to be engaged in, so we're pleased that all of you were able to be here tonight. The second piece of good news is that if, like Raymond, you haven't yet read the book, it's available outside. And the third piece of good news is that clearly there's enough material that Kishore must work on another book, and we look forward to launching that in the near future. Please join me in thanking Kishore and all of you.
The Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy.